There was a time when America believed that small towns were the safest places to grow up. Places where children could ride their bikes until it was almost dark. Places where parents didn't worry every time their child stepped outside. Places where darkness did not mean danger. St. Joseph, Minnesota was one of those places. Quiet dirt roads lined with low trees. Porch lights casting a pale yellow glow just enough to make people believe that everything was fine. No one locked their doors too early. No one thought about strangers. Life moved slowly, familiarly, peacefully, so peaceful that people forgot it could be taken away. Jacob Wetterling grew up in that world, 11 years old. An ordinary boy like millions of American children in the late 1980s. He liked riding his bike. He liked videotapes. He liked uneventful Sunday nights. The evening of October 22, 1989, began exactly like any other. Jacob rode his bike with his younger brother Trevor and his best friend Aaron. The three children had just stopped by a nearby convenience store to rent a video and buy candy. A short distance. A familiar road. A trip they had taken countless times before. None of them knew it would be the last. As their wheels rolled along the empty dirt road, the night felt a little thicker, the air a little colder. And then, from the trees along the roadside, a figure stepped out. The man was tall. He wore a mask. He held a gun. Everything happened in seconds, but the moment stretched endlessly. He ordered the children to turn off their flashlights, forced them to lie face down in the ditch. His voice was low, rough, steady. He asked each of them their age. Then he stopped. Which one was Jacob? In that moment, childhood ended. There was no background music. There was no warning. Only the raw terror of a child realizing he was being called by name by a stranger in the dark. He ordered Trevor and Aaron to run. Do not look back. If they did, he would shoot. The two boys ran in panic, carrying a fear they would never fully shed for the rest of their lives. Behind them, Jacob disappeared into the night. There were no cries for help, no adult witnesses, only an empty road and a terrifying silence. That was the moment St. Joseph lost its innocence. And America, though it did not yet know it, had just stepped into a different era. And then the darkness swallowed the road whole. Trevor and Aaron ran, not because they understood what was happening, but because fear had taken control of their bodies. They ran until their lungs felt ready to burst, until their legs went numb, until the lights of familiar houses appeared ahead. They did not look back. They dared not look back. Because in their minds, that low, hoarse voice still echoed cold, unforgiving, allowing no mistakes. When the door opened, the story flooded into the house like a torrent. Broken sentences, gasping breaths, words that were not enough to describe what had just happened. A man, a gun, a name spoken in the dark. From that moment on, everything happened too fast and yet too slowly. Phones were lifted. Police were called, and the entire town began to wake in confusion. On the dirt road the three children had traveled only moments earlier, police lights cut through the night. Tire tracks stood out clearly. Large and small footprints mixed together in the soft ground. There was no blood. There were no cries for help. Only a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. When Jacob's parents returned home, they had not yet realized that their lives had just entered a different chapter. Throughout the drive, a single question repeated itself, giving them no rest. Who could do this? Who could take a child? They walked into a house filled with people, filled with voices, yet painfully empty. There were no explanations, no answers. Only a void beginning to open, quietly, but growing without pause. The news spread faster than anyone could stop it. Neighbors turned on their lights. Doors opened. Adults stood in small clusters, speaking in voices lower than usual. St. Joseph had never witnessed anything like it. A child had vanished not because of an accident, not because of a natural disaster, but on a road everyone believed was safe. In the first hours, hope was still there. People believed Jacob had simply gotten lost, that he would be found shaking, frightened, but alive, that everything would be all right. But as the night wore on, the silence began to take on a different meaning. Each passing minute was no longer time, but a question without an answer. Each passing hour brought a sense of unease this town had never known. That night, many people did not sleep. And from that night on, many would never sleep peacefully again, because from the moment Jacob disappeared, St. Joseph was no longer the same town. Childhood in America was no longer seen through the same eyes. And peace, once broken, never returns whole. After that night, morning came without bringing light. It arrived carrying a void no one in this town knew how to name. When the sun rose over St. Joseph, everything looked the same. The familiar roads, the silent houses. But the feeling of safety was gone. Inside the Wetterling family's home, time no longer moved at a normal pace. Every footstep on the porch made people hold their breath. Every phone call carried both hope and fear. No one spoke the worst thought aloud, but everyone was thinking it. Jacob Wetterling was no longer there. The bicycle still leaned against the wall. The bedroom remained untouched. Those small things became painful proof that a child had once existed and now did not. In the first 24 hours, the entire town moved as one body. People set aside their work. Parents sent their children to neighbors. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder in the woods, calling the name of a boy they had never met. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters circled overhead. Cars lined up along the narrow dirt roads. Everything was urgent, yet no one knew where to look. Hope was the only thing keeping people going. Hope that Jacob was merely lost. Hope that someone would hear his name being called. Hope that this nightmare might end as quickly as it began. But alongside hope, a fear was growing. If this could happen to Jacob, it could happen to any child. Parents began to keep their children within sight. Evening bike rides disappeared. Roads that once echoed with laughter fell silent. This was no longer the pain of a single family. It became the shared anxiety of an entire community. A void formed, not only where Jacob vanished, but spreading into every home, every meal, every evening. And within that void, a quiet question began to take shape. If Jacob was not found soon, would there come a time when he would never be found at all? And then fear was no longer abstract. It entered every house, sat down at every dinner table, lay beside every child's bed at night. Parents began to look at their children differently, no longer with innocence, no longer with the belief that the world was safe enough. Each time a child slipped out of sight, their hearts tightened. Children sensed it. They asked questions they had never needed to ask before. Why can't I go outside anymore? Why do Mom and Dad always watch me when I walk to school? Why do people whisper when they mention the name Jacob? Inside the Wetterling family's home, every passing hour felt heavy. No one knew what to do except wait. Wait for the phone to ring. Wait for a lead. Wait for a sign that the boy was still somewhere out there. Jacob Wetterling was no longer present, but his absence was everywhere. In meals with one person missing. In a bedroom no one dared to clean. In conversations cut short because no one had the courage to continue. The search continued to expand. People came from neighboring towns. Those who had never met Jacob still called his name into the woods, into the wind, into hours of unbroken silence. There were moments when hope flared over the smallest report, a shirt matching the description, a vague trace. Then it faded again, leaving a deeper emptiness than before. The community began to understand that this was unlike any disappearance they had known. There were no signs of an accident, no simple story to cling to, only a question hanging in the air, one no one dared to speak aloud. If a child could vanish like this, then no one was truly safe. When night fell, St. Joseph sank into an unfamiliar quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of vigilance. Lights stayed on longer. Doors were locked earlier. Small habits began to change, little by little. The void Jacob left behind was no longer a point on a map. It became a constant presence, a quiet unease taking root in everyday life. And it was within that void that America began to realize something. Childhood was no longer protected by distance or familiarity. Safety was no longer a given. And once fear enters a community, it stays for a long time. After the frantic first days of searching, a promise was made. Police said they would not stop, that they would uncover the truth, that justice would come. The Wetterling family believed it because they had no other choice. When your child disappears, you have to believe that the system created to protect children will do its job. Press conferences were held. Appeals were issued. Case files grew thicker with each passing day. But at the same time, something else began to form quietly and dangerously. A deadlock. Investigators returned to the scene again and again. They measured. They photographed. They analyzed every tire track, every footprint pressed into the dirt. But the scene had nothing new to say. And time, the one thing that might heal, was doing the opposite. It erased traces. It dulled memories. It made everything harder to grasp. In the early days, certain names were mentioned. People who lived nearby. People who owned vehicles, owned guns, had habits that caught police attention. One of them had been questioned shortly after the incident. His vehicle matched the description. His gun matched the description. Even his footwear matched the impressions found at the scene. And then his name drifted away. He was not arrested, not charged, not completely ruled out. He was simply set aside. And in that silence, an opportunity was lost. While Jacob Wetterling's family waited for the phone to ring each day, the person who had caused this pain continued to live a normal life. He went to work. He greeted his neighbors. He blended into the community as if nothing had ever happened. No one knew it at the time. But looking back, that was the first moment the system's promise began to crack. A case does not fail only because of a lack of clues. It fails when the right clues are not pursued to the end. And then, it was no longer just a missed lead. It was a larger picture the system failed to see in time. Just months before Jacob disappeared, another boy in the area had been abducted. That boy survived. That boy remembered the attacker's voice clearly. A low, hoarse voice carrying a cold threat. "Run, and don't look back or I'll shoot." The words were identical. They should have been an alarm bell. They should have been the point where two cases intersected. But the connection was not made in time. The files existed side by side, never touching. Matching details were dismissed as coincidence. And another opportunity passed in silence. As months turned into years without answers, pressure began to weigh on investigators. The public wanted results. The family wanted justice. And the system wanted an explanation. In that atmosphere, suspicion settled on someone else. A neighbor. A man who lived near the scene. A man who had been present that night. His life began to collapse not loudly, but cruelly. The community's suspicious glances, the whispers behind his back. Years spent living under the shadow of a crime he did not commit. Police dug into his land. They searched in desperation, but nothing was found. No evidence, no confession, only a human being crushed by suspicion. Meanwhile, the person truly responsible remained untouched. He was not watched. He was not monitored. He was not stopped. This was no longer an individual mistake. It was a chain of failures. Ignoring the right leads, pursuing the wrong direction, and letting time do the rest. With each passing year, the case drifted farther from the possibility of being solved. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. So did trust in the system. And within the Wetterling family, a bitter truth slowly took shape. That the original promise, even if spoken with good intentions, might never be fulfilled. And then, the thing the Wetterling family had always feared finally happened. The case began to fade from public attention. There was no official announcement declaring the investigation a failure. The press conferences simply became less frequent. Search teams withdrew. The names once mentioned no longer appeared on the evening news. The case remained unsolved, but it was no longer pursued as before. It drifted into a gray state where no one declared defeat, yet no one truly moved forward. Inside investigative offices, the file was placed in a drawer, thick, heavy, and gathering dust. For the system, it became a cold case. For the family, it was a sentence with no end. Jacob Wetterling was no longer a boy in the collective memory. He became a photograph, a name, a question without an answer. His parents lived in two parallel timelines. One was the outside world, where life continued. The other was October 22nd, 1989, repeating endlessly. Every time news surfaced of another missing child, hope would rise, and then fade again. Over and over. The most painful thing was not only that Jacob was never found. It was the feeling that if the system had done better, if the first leads had been followed all the way through, if the warnings had been heard in time, then perhaps the story would have been different. The anger did not erupt into shouts. It accumulated in silence, in questions no one answered, in trust eroded little by little. A system created to protect children had failed to keep its promise, not for lack of effort, but because a series of mistakes were never corrected. And as the years passed, that promise became hollow, no longer a commitment, but a painful memory of what should have happened. That was when Jacob's case officially entered the darkness. Not the darkness of complete oblivion, but the darkness of prolonged waiting without an end. And within that darkness, a question continued to hang, not only for the police, but for society as a whole. How many children can we accept disappearing before we admit that the promise to protect them has failed? When the anger settled, it was not relief that followed, but another silence, a longer silence, a heavier one, and far harder to endure. There were no more police sirens at night, no more search teams spreading through the woods, no more promises repeated in front of cameras. Only time remained, and time does not stand with those who are waiting. Life outside continued to move forward. Winters came and went. Other children grew up, left the town, and began lives of their own. But for the Wetterling family, time was trapped. Not in a distant past, but in an autumn evening that never ended. Jacob Wetterling did not grow with the years. He never turned 12. There were no more birthdays, no milestones a family would normally mark. His absence was not loud. It lived in the smallest details: an empty chair at the dinner table, a bedroom kept exactly as it was, as if its owner had only stepped away for a moment, The family learned to live with that pain, not by overcoming it, but by carrying it every day. There is no manual for waiting for a child who never comes home. No timeline to tell you when hope should change its shape. Only a quiet endurance repeated day after day. Outside, the town gradually grew accustomed to the silence, not because people forgot, but because they did not know what else to do. Jacob's story slowly left the front pages, but it did not disappear. It receded, becoming a shadow always present behind everyday life. A shadow reminding people that some wounds do not heal with time. They only change the way they exist. And while the system moved on to other cases, the Wetterling family stayed behind, stayed with unanswered questions, stayed with a space no one could fill. That is how the darkness began to stretch across the years, not loudly, not dramatically, but deep enough to change how people viewed safety, childhood, and trust. Over time, the story no longer belonged to just one family. It seeped into the daily life of America, quietly but persistently. Mornings began with milk cartons placed on kitchen tables. On them, the face of a child, a name, a reminder no one asked for, but no one could ignore. It was the first time fear entered the most ordinary moments, even when everything looked normal. Even when your child was sitting right in front of you, safe, parents began to look at the world differently. Not with panic, but with vigilance. New rules began to form without anyone needing to issue them. Don't go out alone after dark. Don't accept gifts from strangers. Always tell an adult where you are. These rules were not baseless fear. They were the reflex of a society that had just realized safety was not a given. In small communities, meetings were held more often. People talked about neighbors, about those who lived around them, about how to look out for one another more closely, not because everyone was suspicious, but because indifference was no longer a safe option. The Wetterling family continued to appear in public, not loudly, not asking for sympathy. They simply told their story again and again. Each time, they had to reopen an old wound. But they did it so others would not have to endure the same pain. From personal loss, a legacy slowly began to take shape. Discussions about the law. Changes in how society viewed crimes against children. Not everything changed overnight, but the direction had shifted. The darkness of the case was no longer just the memory of a horrific night. It became a warning that stretched across the years. A marker that meant America could not return to its former innocence. And while the world continued to move forward, that shadow remained. Not to spread fear, but to remind people that safety, if it is to be preserved, must be protected every day. As the years passed, waiting no longer looked like clear hope. It became a state of being. The Wetterling family did not wait in despair. They waited through action, by retelling the story, by refusing to let the name disappear from collective memory. That persistence gradually created changes far beyond the scope of a single case. The law began to respond, society began to ask questions, and America, step by step, acknowledged that children needed to be protected by more than belief alone. A law bearing Jacob Wetterling's name was created, not as compensation, but as a permanent reminder that some lessons are written only through loss. For the family, it was not a victory. There is no victory in losing a child. There was only a way to turn pain into something with greater meaning. The darkness of this case never fully disappeared, but it changed shape. From silent fear into awareness. From a personal tragedy into a shared responsibility. As the years passed, there were moments when waiting nearly became part of one's identity. A life built around an unanswered question. A patience that only those who have lost something truly understand. And within that long stretch of silence, something quietly happened. The truth did not vanish. It was simply waiting for the right moment to return. Because some stories do not end when the lights go out, they continue to live in memory, in law, in the way a society learns to protect its most vulnerable. Over time, darkness is not only prolonged pain. It is also the ground from which truth may one day rise into the light, and when that moment comes, it will not erase the years that were lost, but it will give meaning back to the waiting. And then, after many years of silent waiting, the darkness began to shift, not with a loud sound, not with a sudden confession, but with a small change in how people reread the past. Time does not only take hope away, it also carries progress. What once could not be seen began to take shape. In old archives, samples once overlooked were taken out again. Dust-covered files were reopened, not because a new lead emerged from the present, but because the present had finally become capable of understanding the past. DNA technology changed the way investigations were conducted. It did not need testimony. It did not need intact memories. It only needed the truth that remained on the things human hands had touched. Another old case, one thought to be unrelated, was brought back into the light. A child who had survived. An account once dismissed as insufficient. Now those details began to speak the same language. Investigators realized that what they were searching for was not in the future. It was in the past they had already passed through. A familiar name appeared again in the files, not new, not surprising. Only this time, it no longer stood alone. Independent data points began to converge, each fragment, each number, each analytical result. They no longer allowed vague doubt to exist. There was no moment of celebration. Only a prolonged silence in the office. A silence that showed everyone understood they were standing before something irreversible. For the Wetterling family, the news arrived slowly, not in clear sentences, but in the feeling that after decades, the story was finally beginning to move. Jacob Wetterling was no longer just a suspended memory. His name was now tied to a specific line of investigation. A real possibility that the waiting would not be endless. But alongside hope came another fear deeper. That the truth, when revealed, would not bring relief, but a pain with a far more defined shape, because some secrets, while buried, are only darkness. But once brought into the light, they become truths no one can avoid. That name, which had rested in the files for years, was no longer an emotionless line of text. It was attached to a real person, a familiar face in the community, a life so ordinary that no one questioned it. The man did not live in the shadows. He went to work. He had a home. He existed among others without showing any sign of something wrong. That was what made the truth harder to accept. Investigators began to look back at everything they had once overlooked, the earliest interrogations, the samples that had been collected, the signs that had never been strong enough to hold him. This time, they were not looking only through experience. They were looking through evidence. The analytical results left no room for rationalization, no other explanation, no alternative scenario. Only a single path leading straight to the truth. When the search warrant was executed, tension filled the air. No one spoke loudly, no one rushed, because everyone understood that this moment could close decades of waiting. What was found inside did not bring a sense of victory, only heaviness. A heaviness that made it clear how close they had been to the answer for so many years without ever realizing it. The arrest did not unfold like it does in films. There were no blaring sirens, no crowds gathering, just one man being taken away and a new chapter of the story beginning. For the Wetterling family, the information did not bring immediate release. It carried a sense of contradiction, relief that there were finally answers. But wait, because they knew those answers would not be easy. After so many years, the truth was no longer an abstract concept. It had a shape, it had weight, and it was moving closer to a moment that no one could delay any longer. Because once the truth has been named, the only thing left is to face it. The confession did not arrive like a lightning strike. It came slowly, heavily, and it left no room for doubt. Inside the closed room, there was no audience, no stage lights, only questions being asked and answers with no path back. The man began to speak, not loudly, not evasively, just details pulled out of the darkness, one fragment at a time. How he saw 3 children riding their bicycles at night, how he waited, how he called out the name of a child he had never known. Those details brought no sense of victory. They brought only coldness, a coldness that comes from realizing that evil does not always require a complex motive. Sometimes it only needs opportunity. The truth finally reached the Wetterling family, not as liberation, but like a door forced open after years of being tightly shut. Jacob Wetterling was no longer a hanging question. He had an ending to his story, a complete truth, and a pain clearer than ever before. When the burial site was revealed, there were no cheers, only silence. A silence shared by those who understood they had waited far too long for this moment. The truth brought into the light did not restore the lost years. It could not return a childhood. It could not erase the long evenings of waiting. But it ended something else, not knowing, suspension, the torture of having no answers. After decades, the darkness was finally named, not for revenge, but so history could be written correctly. And in that moment, the truth did not carry dazzling light. It carried stillness, a heavy stillness, but a necessary one. Because there are stories that can only move forward once the truth has finally been spoken. When the truth is spoken, people believe justice will follow. It is an instinctive belief that when darkness is exposed, light will come to restore balance. But reality does not operate according to human emotion. Inside the courtroom, there are no grand moral questions. There is only the law, statutes, limits written down many years ago. Time, the very thing that concealed the truth for decades, now becomes the greatest barrier. The most serious crimes no longer fall within the scope of prosecution, not because they are any less painful, but because the legal clock has run out. Prosecutors face a cold choice: accept a plea deal, or risk ending with no conviction at all. Neither option carries a sense of justice. The agreement is not offered to soothe public outrage. It is offered to ensure that the truth will not be buried again, so that, at the very least, Jacob's story does not end in silence. Jacob Wetterling is brought home. His family has a place to mourn. A tangible ending to an invisible wait that lasted nearly 3 decades. But at the same time, another feeling emerges. The sense that this is still not enough. The sentence handed down does not reflect the length of the pain. It does not reflect the years taken away. It does not reflect a childhood lost. Outside the courtroom, the public begins to ask questions. How can a crime like this lead to such a limited sentence? How can justice be constrained by time? It is the moment America confronts an uncomfortable truth. The law does not always move in step with emotional justice. And when the trial comes to an end, the truth has been confirmed, but peace never arrives. When the sentence is announced, the room does not erupt. There are no cheers. No release people had waited for after decades, only silence. A silence different from the years before, not silence born of not knowing, but silence that comes from knowing, and being unable to change anything more. 20 years in prison, a number spoken clearly, brief, cold. To the law, it is the result of a calculation. To the Wetterling family, it is a number that can never be converted into what was lost. No sentence can measure 30 years of waiting. There is no scale for sleepless nights stretched endlessly. No statute that records birthdays that never came. Jacob's family does not protest with shouts. They do not stand before cameras in anger. They listen, lower their heads, and carry a weight no one else can shoulder. Jacob Wetterling is finally named in a sentence. But that sentence does not close the pain. It closes only a legal chapter. Outside, public reaction begins to swell. Questions multiply. Why is a crime like this not prosecuted to its fullest extent? Why is time allowed to become a shield for evil? The outrage is not aimed at one individual alone. It is directed at the system itself. At limits written long ago, never questioned until it was too late. This is the moment America is forced to face a bitter paradox. That legal justice is not always moral justice. That the truth may be found, but fairness arrives only in part. For the Wetterling family, there is no concept of victory, only the end of a search, and the beginning of another journey living with the truth now known. This time, justice carries no sweetness. It carries bitterness. But it is a bitterness necessary to keep society from looking away. Because if this story ends here, its greatest lesson will be lost. And from that incompleteness, a question begins to echo in the public conscience. Should the law change? Should statutes of limitations exist for crimes that steal childhoods? And how much unfinished justice are we willing to accept? When the trial ends, the story does not stop. It only changes form. It is no longer a legal file, no longer a sentence, but a question hanging in the minds of those who have followed this journey from the beginning. What have we learned? The story of Jacob Wetterling is not only a personal tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting how a society understands safety, how we place trust, and how we sometimes underestimate dangers hiding very close to home. There was a time when people believed children were safe if they were within a familiar community, if neighbors were nearby, if the road home was short enough to reach before nightfall. This story ended that belief, not to spread fear, but to remind us that safety does not come from familiarity. It comes from vigilance. The perpetrator did not resemble the monster of imagination. He did not live on the margins of society. He existed among others, ordinary enough to go unnoticed. That is the hardest lesson to accept, that evil does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers and waits. The victim's family did not choose silence. They chose to retell the story again and again, not to relive the pain, but to ensure that the pain would not become meaningless. That persistence poses a question to all of us. If they could stand after the greatest loss imaginable, what responsibility does society carry to ensure the same mistakes are not repeated? Reflection is not about looking back to assign blame. It is about looking back to understand and to change. If this story were to happen today, the danger might not be waiting at the end of a deserted dirt road. It might already be inside the child's room. The world has changed, but predators have not disappeared. They have only changed their methods. Today, evil does not need a mask. It does not need a gun. It does not need to step out of the shadows. It can appear on a glowing screen, in the form of a harmless message, a gesture of fake concern, a stranger who knows how to listen. That is why the story of Jacob Wetterling does not belong to the past. It speaks directly to the present. Parents today do not only worry when their children go outside. They worry when their children are in their rooms, when the door is locked, when everything appears safe. Children are taught how to cross the street. But they are not always taught how to recognize invisible danger, sweet words, promises, relationships that begin with trust. The greatest warning is not fear. It is complacency. We often believe tragedy happens only to others, somewhere else, in different circumstances. But history shows the opposite. Tragedy often begins in the most familiar places, on the most ordinary days, and to children who have done nothing wrong. Safety does not come from extreme control. It comes from education, from talking with children, from listening when they say something makes them uncomfortable. The old rules still matter. Run when you feel danger. Scream when you need help. Fight back when there is no other choice. But more important than anything else is creating a space where children know they can always speak up, without fear of being scolded, without fear of being seen as weak. Because many tragedies do not happen due to a lack of rules, but because of a lack of listening. As this story reaches its end, what remains is not outrage, but responsibility. The responsibility of a society that once believed terrible things only happened far away. The responsibility of adults, those entrusted with protecting people who are not yet able to protect themselves. The story of Jacob Wetterling raises questions that are not easy to answer. Is the law keeping up with reality? Should statutes of limitations exist for crimes that steal childhood? Are we willing to accept that some pain cannot be measured in years of imprisonment? There is no single answer for everyone. But asking the questions is not optional, because silence has never protected anyone. If you are a parent, take time to talk to your child tonight, not through fear, but through trust. If you are a neighbor, pay closer attention to what is happening around you, not through suspicion, but through a sense of community responsibility. If you are a citizen, ask yourself whether current laws are enough to protect children, and if they are not, whether we are willing to demand change. This story does not ask you to live in anxiety. It only asks you not to take safety for granted. Because many tragedies begin on completely ordinary days, on familiar roads, and from the belief that bad things will not happen to us. If you believe this story should be shared to remind more people, share it. Talk about it. Let it become a warning, not just a sad memory. And tonight, before turning off the lights, hold your loved ones one more time, not out of fear, but out of love. Because the greatest vigilance of a civilized society is never allowing a child to become a story told too late.